Hello, I'm Michael Wiegers from Copper Canyon Press, and I want to give people a few minutes here to join us. But I'll just start by saying, um, you know, thank you for joining us, and talking. I'm talking with you from the office in my home here on coastal Salish land, the Sklallam people, and I'm just thrilled to be here tonight to talk with Arthur Z, our United States Poet Laureate. Arthur and I. Well, I should say I've had the privilege of working with Arthur for over 30 years, and he is a singular voice and mind in American literature. He's transformed American poetry. He's transformed the lives of many of his students and has influenced so many generations of poetry. And I can say as well that he has transformed and really guided my life in so many ways. I consider him and his wife, the wonderful poet Carol Moldau, to be really, close and dear friends. And it's just a um, remarkable experience to be able to share this accolade with Arthur of him being named the U.S. Poet Laureate. Um, I guess I'd like to say that there are um, few people I know, much less few poets that I know who are as generous and just really brilliant as Arthur. And so I would like to welcome Arthur to join us on camera here. At the same time that my cat, who is always the star of the show, is welcoming herself onto camera. Welcome, Arthur.
Hi, Michael.
Hello. So, I know people are just joining us here, but I'd love to just get started. As my colleague Elizabeth Brugman just said a few moments ago to us, we're trying to cover 1,500 years of poetry in 1 hour. So let's get going. I have tons of questions for you, and I'm going to invite also people who are out there to please hop into the chat and send us questions. And I'll do my best to keep up with them and ask them of you, Arthur. From the moment that you called me and told me that you had been named and accepted the position of the poet laureate of the U.S. And I forget how many people actually recommended you, but you were the from writers around the country, critics around the country, librarians, teachers, etc., recommended you, and you were just by far and away the first choice as poet laureate. And from the moment that you mentioned that, you said that you wanted to focus on poetry and translation. Despite what you said yesterday in the New York Times about poetry invites us to slow down, I've never seen any poet move as quickly as you did. And you started, writing this book, Transient Worlds. Clearly, you had been thinking about this for a lifetime, thinking about the importance of translation in your own writing. But I'm hoping that you can, tell our audience a little bit about why translation. Why is this your point of advocacy?
Sure. Many people may know that unlike many American poets, I did not go to graduate school and get an MFA in creative writing. When I was a student at the University of California at Berkeley, I started translating classical Chinese poetry into English, not thinking that it would go beyond that, but over decades of writing, translation has become really fundamental to me in so many ways. And when I was given the opportunity to serve as the U.S. Poet Laureate, I wanted to do something with poetry and translation because first, it hadn't been done before, and because also it was so crucial to my own evolution and journey as a poet. And yes, I put the book together in record time, I believe within 3 months, because we wanted to have the book come out at the end of my first year. I wanted to make that happen. And I want to say that a number of things made that possible. For 22 years, I taught at the Institute of American Indian Arts, and I invented a class called the Poetic Image because Native students came into my class feeling very tense about poetry. And I found that if they could make translations from Chinese, they could loosen up, they could play with language, they could use their imaginations. And it not only freed them in terms of making a translation, but it opened up the possibilities for their own evolution as poets. And so I had that in the back of my mind, and I thought, well, what if I put a book together that moves between many different languages, many different time periods? We tend to be obsessed with what's new, what's popular, what's of the moment. And I thought, why not have an ancient Chinese poem from 418 Common Era next to a poet from, say, who's Palestinian, who was living in Istanbul, writing a poem, and or a poet from Chile or a poet from Japan, to be able to bring into conversation all of these different literatures and worlds through poetry, and to present multiple translations so that there's it's clear that there's no definitive translation.
Yeah, I love that. I think, it's also it points to something else you've talked about as well, that I think there's no definitive um translation, and there's no such thing as a national language. For example, our the English language is polyglot. It's made up of many influences, and I think there's some great beauty in this project, and particularly in these times, when books are being banned, here you are trying to open up the world to many different stories, many different visions. And so, for those who haven't seen the book itself, can you maybe tell folks a little bit about how you put it together? What what was the first poem, for example, that you thought of that you really wanted to turn to?
The first poem I thought of was the poem that's foundational, that's in what I call Zone One. It's a drinking wine poem by Tao Chen, written in about 418 Common Era. I wanted the book to be multivalent, meaning to have many uses so that you could just read through and enjoy the translations. That could widen and deepen your appreciation of poetry. But I also wanted it to be hands-on so that in certain zones, and I call them zones instead of chapters because if I say chapter 9, I feel like that implies you need to read 1 through 8, then 9 builds on that. But I really wanted each zone to be independent, to approach language in a fresh and surprising way. So I started with poems that I loved. There's the Tao Chen poem. There's the Pablo Neruda poem, Solo La Muerte. I knew I wanted those two. I love Sappho 31. And I don't read any ancient Greek, but it was such a pleasure to juxtapose four different translations, Guy Davenport and Carson, Mary Barnard, and Jim Powell, and say in the discussion, I can find something of value and something really interesting that each translator did to bring across, which is the etymology of translate into English. So I sort of worked from the inside out. I didn't have a linear progression. I wanted, for instance, if a reader knew German and liked Rilke. The last section, Zone 15, is Archaic Torso of Apollo, and I juxtaposed two different translations there. I wanted someone who knew another language to be able to jump right into where they were comfortable and interested, but I also wanted to bring readers to new worlds. So, for instance, in Zone 2, there's a two-word compound Navajo poem in the Dene language by Orlando White. So the poem is full of surprises, and really the book grew through this idea of interpollinating and having conversations. So I have a haiku that I selected from Kobayashi Isa, which very simply is the daikon picker points the way with a daikon. And I talk about that in that zone. But I noticed, for instance, even though I don't read Japanese, the character, the Chinese character, is there for Wei, which is also Tao or Taoism. And then I thought, oh, I should have four different translations of the opening chapter of the Tao Te Ching. So I wanted poems that were lyrical, that were narrative, that were dramatic. I've got a passage from the Iliad just before a battle. It's a nighttime scene. And in that zone, I wanted to really open up the idea of translation, where the source is not just being translated, but it can be used as source material for original poetry. So really, the book grew from the inside out, and then I got to a point where I thought 15 is just right. This is 22 poems from 13 languages. Let's stop here.
Yeah, and I think you did that all in a matter of weeks. But just even looking at something like, this idea of zones rather than chapters, I love how throughout your whole ethos is essentially inclusive, giving people permission. Not saying, okay, you need to jump in here and read straight through. You can, pull from any section of the book, and it's an invitation. And I sense, what I know from you and from this book that, it does become a very, I think again in this era when we're looking at attempts to quell diversity and equity and inclusion, this is a very inclusive, equitable process that says, anybody can read this how they want to. You too can translate. You show examples, I think, such where there are collaborative translations matching a native speaker with a poet. And just I love that sort of vision throughout the book that it's a way to say that you can translate, you can approach other literatures, other stories, bring them into your own voice, and then maybe have them affect your own voice, affect your own poetry. Um, I think I guess along those lines, I'm wondering if you can maybe, you know, I know that there are plenty of poetry readers out there with us tonight, but in this role as poet laureate, you're bringing also new readers to poetry and to literature in translation, and I'm wondering if you can maybe speak a little bit to those poets or those people, those readers, listeners who may be experiencing poetry for the first time and talk about translation. And also, I'm going to invite you in a little bit to read, a poem or two aloud. And what happens when you read a poem, when you take it from your own thoughts, you're in quiet internal reading, and you give voice to it, which to my mind, that's kind of what translation is doing. It's bringing your personal voice to the experience of a poem. But sorry, I'm rambling. Please,
No,
that's a
it's great.
question
I'm
in
not
there.
sure where to respond to that. I guess I want to just hold up the book and show that I wanted it to be a very small format book because I
Mhm.
wanted someone to be able to like put it in their coat pocket, and you could, take it on a hike to a lake. You could read it on an airplane. It can go into a classroom. That again, it'd be multivalent, that there'd be many possibilities. And for people who don't read a lot of poetry, I wanted this book to be inviting. Poetry sometimes is thought of as intimidating because it's so difficult or esoteric, but really, for instance, if you open to the three haikus that are in this book, they're extremely accessible. Um, Someone in elementary school could read them, and it's got the Japanese with the English, and so I think it's a book that really invites a reader to experience the different worlds that are there. And, a reader may not know Inger Christensen, for instance. And here I'm drawing from Danish. And when I read Inger's book, Alphabet, um, my wife, Carol Moldau, said to me, I was reading it one night, and she said, I've never seen you so excited in a long time. And I said, yeah, and once I started this, I can't wait to see how it unfolds. And so um, I picked the opening stanzas to Alphabet, which starts very simply and it builds and builds and builds. And you can say it's ecological. It's a whole vision of the world. And interestingly, in terms of dynamics of translators, we often think of, oh, sound gets lost, rhythm gets lost. I chose Inger's poem because I loved it. And then I discovered through looking at interviews that her translator, Susanna Need, would go to Copenhagen, and Inger knew English, and they would read the Danish, read the English, and listen to the sounds and the rhythms and go back and forth. And this happened over decades. So this was not like pulling a book off a shelf saying, oh, I'll translate it. This became a really wonderful sense of intimate collaboration. And that's the kind of thing I'm hoping to extend to a reader.
Yeah, and that book in particular, for all of you out there, if you've not, you should definitely read it. It's an abecedarian and it's a Fibonacci. So abecedarian, so that's A, B, C, D. So each line starts with a letter of the alphabet. And a Fibonacci is, as you may may all know, it's kind of the golden ratio. 1 + 1 = 2, 1 + 2 = 3, 2 + 3 = 5, and it builds. And that's, the physics or the mathematics and on which everything around us is built. But the writer has written that in this poem, which starts with A, the atom bomb, and ends with the destruction of the world. And it just builds across in Danish, but then to translate that and to find the accurate translation in English, just it's for me, it's just an extraordinary feat. But
I just want
well,
to
sorry.
jump in and say that one of the things I hope Transient Worlds can be is also a source book that someone could read the opening to Alphabet and say, oh, I'm interested in this. I should go track down Inger Christensen's poetry. Or a reader might say, oh, I don't never heard of Tao Chen, an ancient Chinese poet. I should go look for. So I'm hoping this book again has many different purposes and values. And I can't resist jumping in about Alphabet,
Mhm.
that it's over 200 lines before the speaker of the poem actually appears. And the phrase is something like, I stand at my sink peeling potatoes, which is such a mundane thing. And as you say, she's had this vision of atom bomb and all of these world life-changing experiences. And there she is doing something very mundane, like preparing dinner.
Right, right, right. No, it's just a really extraordinary book, and my hope is also that people will turn to many of the poets that you've brought forward in it. So maybe we can turn to the book itself, and as we look at translation, as you said before, there's no perfect translation, no singular translation, and I think particularly with poetry. It's, we've all had the experience with Google Translation being just, frustrating and yet with poetry, you're not just translating the words, you're translating the blank space on the page, you're translating so much more. And And I'm wondering, if you might, I think you wanted to point out Guillaume Apollinaire's Loyer, the Carnation, and maybe my colleagues can call that poem up on screen for us. I hope you can all see that.
Great. So, yes, one of the things I wanted to do was, I mean, Apollinaire is such a versatile poet. There's the great love poem, the Poème Mirabeau. There's the long, meandering poem, Zone, which is how I got the idea of calling each section of this book a zone, because it has its own integrity, but there is a kind of through line to it. So here, Apollinaire, this is from Apollinaire's book, Calligram, which is portmanteau. It's splicing two words together, calligraphy, and I'm trying to think of the other one. What is pictogram, I believe. And Apollinaire himself says these poems are visual lyricism. And I really like that. So, on the one hand, sometimes visual poems are denigrated as, oh, this is a cheap trick or whatever. But I think there are really interesting aspects to Apollinaire's work, and here he's willing to take risks. So the Roger Shattuck gives you the literal translation, basically, of what's in the French, which you can read on your own. But I want to point out that at the bottom in the French, sagesse, with my limited French, I think of that as wisdom rather
Mhm.
than knowledge. But more importantly, in terms of the visual aspect of the poem, it seems to me the carnation, the flower, extends out from sagesse. That sagesse visually is like the root, is like the primary stalk, and then there are little leaves or little outcroppings from that. But the poem moves, up to the image of this flower or flowering, and so sometimes visual images, because you're working like with a painting or a collage, they're communicating something. First, that the poem is made of words. So there's that sense of materiality. And words are sometimes smaller or larger in Apollinaire's poem. And putting sagesse in capitals to me emphasizes, interestingly, that this idea of a flowering really depends on being rooted or having a primary stock of wisdom or
Mhm.
knowledge.
I love that. I love that. The um, Yeah, and as you were speaking, I was thinking there's a poet that, who was near and dear to me, Hayden Carruth, and I love one of the things that he writes in one of his poems. And he says, a poem is neither object nor expression, yet somewhat partakes of both. What a poem is never to be known, for which I've learned to be grateful. And I love that idea that a poem is not just us, opening a vein on the page. It's not just expression, but it's also material. And I think this is a perfect example of, using of playing of, using language as material. Um,
I
maybe
want
we
to
can,
add, if I can just
sorry,
jump in,
please,
that
please shut me up.
I don't, I'm choosing translations I admire. So I'm not like saying this one's terrible, that's great. I feel like I'm choosing poems I love, I'm choosing translations I admire. But in this, and I discuss the different translations for each zone. And sometimes, again, I invite the reader to make their own translation. But in this particular zone, I can't resist nudging or finding quibbling with Roger Shattuck, because I feel like he missed the opportunity, or he could have had two versions of the translation where this is version one. But what if he had mimicked the shape of the French using his English translation? It seems to me he missed an important opportunity where the English translation could have mirrored what's happening in the French. And that's just a thought. And again,
Sure.
um, yeah, it's something to think about.
Yeah, I wonder also, I can't remember when Shattuck did this translation, but it may have been in an era before desktop computing, and so how would you, on your typewriter, say,
Right.
do it? So, yeah, I think it's something that looking at that materiality of language, the written language is important, and maybe we can jump to one of your former students at the Institute of American Indian Arts, Orlando White, and I'd love for you to talk about again. This is very much a material poem.
So, yeah, in many ways, I see this book as a celebration of language, imaginative language. Here is I call it a two-word compound poem in the Dene language, in the Navajo language. Hosho, Hozho, means beauty, balance, harmony, and I'm probably mispronouncing the other word. Hosho means imbalance. And the active translation happens in a footnote here on the page. But I also wanted to, in this zone, talk about how cultural context is so important, how a word can be so charged. And Hosho can be made into a cliche where it's just beauty, harmony. But Harry Walters, who was the director of the Dene Museum on the Navajo Reservation for decades, says in an interesting essay, Hosho is also the beauty is has to do with how everything is interconnected, and that's often never recognized or admitted in the translation. And that sense of interconnection is something really important. And the imbalance that's inverted, and then they're joined by the letter O and tilted, to me is showing a world that's out of balance, as so many things happen in life. Something happens and it's disrupted. And I talk a little bit about the Navajo language, how, for instance, because I want the reader to get a little more cultural context. The Navajos have a ceremony for when an infant has their first laugh. And I think that's so amazing, that celebration of joy. And the Navajo language, the Dene language, is built around the verb to go. Whereas I think of English, and I'm thinking of Hamlet, right? To be or not to be, is built around the verb to be, existence. But the Dene language is already thinking of life as a journey, and that's manifested in this mini language piece, but the microcosm is also a macrocosm. To me, it's also saying the very minute is connected to the very large, that balance is forever connected to imbalance. And at this moment, it's tilted. At another moment, might be right side up or, linearly horizontal across the page. But there's a sense of the precariousness of existence and of life. So I may be reading a lot of this in, but I love juxtaposing this to the Apollinaire because it's taking two words and also making a kind of visual lyricism.
Yeah, I even your note in this book is, for many of us as a translation, when you talk about, how you refer, you refer to Navajo when you're looking from the outside, but from within, from within Dene culture, you're referring to it as Dene, and I'm curious how your years of teaching at the institute, how did that encounter with I'm assuming many native languages, how did that shape your poetics? How did it shape your translation as well as the poems that you write on your own?
Um, During the 22 years I taught at the Institute, I probably worked with Native students from over 200 tribes across the United States and all ages from 18 to 80. And when I, in the poetic image, presented a poem in from ancient Chinese and said this is a tonal language, many of the Native students said, "Oh yeah, we totally get that. Our languages are tonal." Um, I became interested. I think it was Auden who said every poet is above all else passionate about language. I've
Mhm.
always liked that. And when I discovered that the Hopi language has male and female languages, I started a poem of my own called Parallax that starts Kwa Kwa Askwali. And
Mhm.
it's when a man says thank you, and then when a woman says thank you, and the poem reveals that. So there are linguistic influences there. There are, I don't know, worldview influences. And I would say fundamentally, um, a sense of respect for different cultures and languages and traditions. Because, Native Americans, that's not a uniform group of people. Plains Indians very different from Pueblos, or very different from, say, Inupiat or Comanche. They're all very distinct, and but that sense of respect through diversity is something that I hope is also carried forth in this book, meaning it's not hierarchical. There's a Chinese poem, and then there's a Navajo poem, and there's a poem in French, a poem in Spanish, German, Arabic, Hebrew, the Mayan language, Tzeltal, Danish. It goes all over the world.
Right, right. Yeah, and I think with each one, we're learning a little more about each culture. And there was something that you said a second ago, when you referenced Shakespeare um and um I may be taking us off track a little bit here, but I think it also is apropos to your Auden comment. The Dene language, is that largely verb based? Is that I spent some time with one of your students, Sherwin Bitsui, and I remember him, telling me a little bit about the language. This was many years ago. And is that primarily a verb-based language?
As I understand it, it is. We'd have to have Sherwin or Orlando or
Mhm.
another Dene speaker confirm that, but I believe the verbs are extremely powerful and pivotal in the
Right.
language.
Right. So everything's always in motion and in movement. So,
Yes.
um, okay. Well, we can, maybe take the poem off the screen, but I guess I would love for you to also maybe, I'd love for you to talk about, some of the other poems, maybe the Neruda or the Iliad, and then I'm going to ask you to perhaps read, some of your own work and your own translations. But so again, in the New York Times, you singled out the Neruda. So tell me a little bit about why that one is important to you, and maybe share it with us.
Sure. When I first read Neruda as an undergraduate at Berkeley, I was really stunned by the poems in the Residencia, the really dark, surreal, brooding poems. Um, and this one is from Residencia 2, Solo La Muerte. And I took two translators, Robert Bly and Donald Walsh, because I thought the Donald Walsh was more literal. And the Bly is, some people say he makes every translation sound like Robert Bly. That's been a complaint, but he is a poet.
Right.
And um, and it was funny. It was only after I selected these two and did a little research, it was like they actually hated each other. But so the Donald Walsh was like, Bly, you don't really know the Spanish. You make a lot of mistakes. And the Bly was like, you may know the Spanish, but you're not a poet. You can't make the voice alive. So, I mean, that's one of the classic uh, dichotomies really in translating. And I think with this, we could talk for hours. That just going to read the last two stanzas for fun. Here's the Donald Walsh. Um, to Solo La Muerte, which he translates as only death. Death is in the cots, in the slow mattresses, in the black blankets. She lives stretched out and she suddenly blows. She blows a dark sound that puffs out sheets. And there are beds sailing to a port where she is waiting, dressed as an admiral. I mean, the poem shows how death is sort of everywhere doing these amazing things. But it interests me that Donald Walsh takes, La Muerte from the Spanish and uses the feminine, and death is a woman. And the Bly is very, very different, bright with the gender, but also in the phrasing. Here's the end to the Bly translation. Death is inside the folding cots. It spends its life sleeping on the slow mattresses in the black blankets and suddenly breathes out. It blows out a mournful sound that swells the sheets, and the beds go sailing toward a port where death is waiting, dressed like an admiral.
Yeah, and even in hearing you read the two, I'm hearing like a slight variation in your voice, and if I go back to a question I was asking before, just giving voice to the two poems, you are one, you're giving voice to Bly on one hand, and you're giving voice to Donald Walsh on the other, and yet also giving voice presumably to Neruda. So um, yeah, I'm just wondering how even um, uh, as you are deciding on translations, how much of that is you reading it aloud? I mean, how much of it is listening, your inner ear? And do you read translations aloud as a part of judging how pleasant they are or how they use the language?
Are you talking about how I choose a poem to translate, or once I've chosen the poem, how I?
So,
Uh-huh.
no, I think, so in both those cases, you've read them aloud, and I'm wondering if just reading a poem aloud changes how you feel about it. I
Sure.
know that, I've read things aloud and discovered things that I didn't realize were in the poems, and I'm
Yes.
wondering
Yes.
if that's the same thing with the translation and how it might be different.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, Spanish to English or any language to English, you're going to lose the sounds, the rhythms, the tonality is going to be different. But I would hope a reader would read the translations aloud. And actually, in my discussion of the Bly and the Walsh translations, I say that just as a poet, in my experience, I find myself by the end of the Bly translation, feeling like there's a momentum behind the voice that really interests me. And the Walsh can be maybe more literally accurate, but I'm still hungering for a little more there behind the voice. So, absolutely, in terms of reading the translation aloud and that way you feel it in your own body, in your physicality. And as you say, it could be as simple as the vowel sounds. I may be making an aside, and I know we're running out of time. We could talk for hours. But when I
Sorry.
visited the Library of Congress, they played for me a passage from Pablo Neruda when
Mhm.
he visited the Library of Congress. And the moment I heard Del Aire al Aire, I knew immediately that was the opening to the Heights of Machu Picchu. But
Mhm.
what I didn't expect was the way that Neruda leaned on the vowel sounds. And
Mhm.
that really stunned me. And I went back and I read that aloud to myself, thinking about, oh, now I've heard it in Neruda's voice. It really changed how I experienced the Spanish. So that act of personalizing it is so critical.
Right. Yeah, I think in certain ways, I'm gonna maybe get a little woo-woo here, but one, I always want to encourage people to read poems aloud to one another. We start and end every meeting at Copper Canyon Press by reading a poem aloud. Somebody will read it, and I want to encourage everybody in the audience to, read a poem aloud tonight to your partner, husband, wife, child, whomever, best friend, and embody the poem, um, and um, and I just I think that it is transformative to the poem and to the understanding. It's also kind of an act of, again, woo woo here, an act of love for ourselves, to really
Yes.
take this poem in fully into our bodies. Um, Another poem I'm hoping you can maybe talk a little bit about is the Iliad, and then and if you can talk a little bit about that particular choice.
Yes. So I knew I wanted to use my favorite passage from the Iliad, and I think it's too long to read here. It's in Robert Fagel's translation. But I want to say It's at night, it's before the dawn of a battle between the Trojans and the Greeks, and Zeus has told the other gods and goddesses they cannot get involved and save their favorite mortal from death. So there's a sense of vulnerability. And there's this fantastic image of the looking up at the stars at night and seeing these points of light. And then the brilliant thing Homer does is he flips it so that then you're looking down on Earth, seeing the scattered campfires of the Trojans before they do battle the next day. So that's an amazing passage. But rather than like put three different translations together, I thought, look, I like the Fagles. I want to show that this poem, that translation can be more than just taking the text and saying, here, how do we carry it over? How do we translate it? What if the translation becomes source material, seeds for our own creativity? And Alice Oswald wrote a wonderful book called Memorial, and she says I'm using her phrase here, excavates the original text. And her book starts with a list of warriors who are mentioned and they appear and they're killed, and that's it. But she starts with a catalog, a list of them, and then she invents backstories and she uses Homeric techniques, including the Homeric simile, um, just the oral tradition, and what a beautiful thing that she does. So that's another aspect to this book. I want to really sort of expand the idea that translation doesn't have to be so limited. It can be
Right.
transformative. It can be um, the catalyst that helps a reader make their own original poem.
Right, and that book, the Oswald book in particular, is really it translates to a feeling or a moment that we might understand. In that she has this catalog of names, and it might be like reading the Vietnam War Memorial. It's just a catalog of names, and you realize, here's this epic tale of war, and then she's like, here are the people who died, and this is how they died, and it kind of modernizes it in a way that I really love. So
One thing I'd like to add, if we have a moment, is
yeah,
the
we've got a
idea
few a little longer.
of, the idea of layering to a text. When I
Mhm.
talk about Kobayashi Isa, I talk about how, the daikon picker points the way with the daikon. He's not just telling Isa, how do you get to this village? He's showing Isa how to live because the way is the character Tao.
Right.
And one of the things I really admire about the Oswald book is she's so psychologically astute. In the opening passage, the first warrior who's killed, Protesilaus, I believe, she has this phrase, dying to leap to shore. And of
Mhm.
course, you could be dying to leap to shore because you want to be the first warrior and get into the action. But there's also the prophecy that the first warrior who lands is going to be killed very quickly. So
Um,
there's a sense of the way she uses the language looks simple, but the layering that she's drawing on, pulling on the Homeric history, and this ties back to Orlando White and the sort of cultural lineage or impetus or momentum behind a single word or phrase, dying to do something becomes so ambivalent and so powerful. It's again really exciting to see how a certain passage or passages from, say, the Iliad could engender an entire book length poem.
Yeah, well, and just quickly, and I want to get you to some of your poems here. For those who have read the novel Cold Mountain by Charles Frazier, the very first scene in that book is a farmer pointing the way with, I think it's a green onion in that novel, but you see that
Yeah,
poem, that gesture, informing other literature. So I know that. So you you know the poem by Dao Chin, the drinking wine, is an important one to you, but there's a poem that has influenced some of your own writing, your own poem, and I'm hoping that maybe you could read Letter to Dao Chin, and tell us a
sure,
little bit about that and that
sure.
poem.
So I just want to say in one of the zones or at the very end, I believe I sort of turn to the reader and again say, okay, various translations, the possibility of them has happened. What is the poem that you could write that could only have been written after having made the translation? I like the idea that making a translation isn't an end, but it's part of a pathway. And so I was had the good fortune to be at the Merwin Conservancy a few summers ago, and I was sitting at William Merwin's desk, and I pulled down a copy of Shadow of Sirius, and he had a poem called Letter to Sudong Po, and I thought, wait a minute, I can do that. I can write a poem to a Chinese poet, and who would I write to? And I thought, I've always loved the end to the Tao Chen poem, and I thought I'll make that end that beginning. So here it is. Letter to Tao Chen. I wish to tell you, but lose the words. More than a millennium later, on another continent, in another language, I know adversity strengthened you. Today we possess antibiotics, cars, cell phones. Scientists use infrared scanners, check a wildfire that has charred 341,735 acres. When you picked chrysanthemums by the bamboo fence to the east, then gazed at mountains to the south, at birds homing at sunset, you turned in three directions, centering yourself. Though you omitted north, I posit mortality as you sipped wine. Today we have no spell that lessens loss. A neighbor's backhoe beeps as it excavates a slope. Sifting your words, I dig at this site where pines scent after rain. A black swallowtail lands on Russian sage, bending the stalk. As it imbibes nectar and sways, I sway. Light slants all that we do.
Beautiful. Thank you. Um, And we've got another, I think, 10 minutes or so, I believe. And I'm just, I'm going to invite people if you want to put a question. I'm sorry I've not been able to keep up with all of the comments, comments here. But if there are any questions you'd like to ask Arthur, please, quickly write some for me to relay to him. Um, I guess I'd also like to, just maybe you know, come back to the laureateship, the project itself, and tell me, you know, and we're gonna get to your final poem about the Library of Congress, but can you maybe tell our audience a little bit about what the Poet Laureate's office is like, what the Library of Congress itself is like, what's your experience there at that place in this time?
Um, the poetry room at the Library of Congress looks out toward the Capitol, and I always think of Elizabeth Bishop's poem.
Mhm.
I think it's called Viewing the Capitol from the Library of Congress. um, I mean, it's an amazing resource. And when I visited the Library of Congress, the different division heads presented different gems from their collection. So I got to see books from many different languages, many of which I had no idea what I was looking at. And some, for instance, the Chinese, I knew exactly what I was looking at. And the curator, Kei Chu, brought out woodblock prints of many of the poems I had translated. So that was a lot of fun to see. Um, I think being the poet laureate is a challenge. The New York Times said, "Is it fun?" I said, "It's a challenge." And I loved it when lawyers came up to me after a reading saying, we try these high-powered litigant, legal cases, and we decided to take the morning off to listen to you and hear some poetry. And that made such a difference. I mean, to me, that was really moving. And that's something that if I can do that as a poet laureate, I feel is very fulfilling.
Well, couple of questions have come in. First of all, Raja asks about if there's any Russian poetry, and I'll say that yes, your wife Carol has translated Marina Tsvetaeva. I never get the name right. It forms in my head, but I can never get it off my tongue. And so I'm wondering. When this from having edited anthologies and trying to bring other people's. Are there any languages that you now wish you had
Mm.
brought into the anthology? Is there something what are you thinking of next?
Well, two things. I first want to step back to the issue of the translation of Russian poetry, because my wife, Carol Moldau, doesn't know Russian, but her good friend, Irina Ross, here in Santa Fe, not only is fluent in Russian, but she recites Russian poetry to herself. It's in her blood. And so Carol and Irina collaborated. Carol recorded Irina reading the poem in Russian, and then they worked through the Cyrillic alphabet and line by line, phrase by phrase, and it was a lot of fun to compare it to the Lane Feinstein translation. And this may be one of the more controversial or risk-taking aspects to the book, is at the end of that zone, I tell the reader, I invite the reader, go translate a poem through collaboration. Reach out to a family member, a teacher, a friend, someone who knows the language better than you. You may not even know the language at all. Pick a poem that really interests you, that you admire, and make a translation through collaboration. Work with that person who knows the language. Um, and then to come back to your question about what got left out or what could go into a future sort of volume, I think it's endless. I
Right,
felt frustrated that there were so many poems that I admired that I couldn't fit in. I wouldn't know where to begin. There are just so many. I felt like again, this is just starting something in motion. I'm the first poet laureate to choose poetry and translation, and may there come others after me who can sort of build on what I'm initiating.
right. And just as you said that there's no perfect translation. I remember years ago when I was doing some translations and the poet and your good friend Forrest Gander said never go back and revisit your translations. And I'm wondering if you feel that as well as you've grown older. One of our audience has asked about how you've translated differently as you've grown older, and I'm wondering have would you revise any of your own translations?
I don't think I would revise any of my translations, but I do differ from Forrest in that I do go back to the early ones and think about, okay, I would do this differently. And isn't that interesting? And how is it I made the decisions I did at 21 that I'm not, making now? And oftentimes that has to do with sound and rhythm. So, for
Right,
instance, in my early translations, I would take a classical line of Chinese poetry, 7 characters, and render it in one line of English. And today I would think, well, wait a minute, they're too caesurous, they're two breaks of sound. What if the translation uses the silences and there are 2 lines in English for each line of Chinese? Or so for me, that's interesting. I like to think, oh, okay, I would do things differently, but I wouldn't want to revise the earlier translation. I feel like it would be very hard for me to step into that, or I just muck it up.
right,
Maybe it might be interesting to retranslate that poem,
right.
like 40 years later.
Right, right. And I think, even with your book Silk Dragon, you came back and re-envisioned that book. And most likely, Forrest was being comforting of me and my insecurities about my translation. I think one of the things with translation is there's always something to compare it against, which is, kind of what this book is doing. Whereas, an original poem, it can only be compared to your voice, I suppose. Um, So, gosh, so we are running low on some time here. There are more questions that, I would like to, I would like to get to here, but, I want to just tell everybody that Arthur has committed to a second term as the poet laureate, which, is really exciting. And I'm hoping that maybe you can tell a little bit about the program that you're doing about, working with some grad students to bring translation workshops around the country.
So yes, it's in process. Let me say, for the first year, I thought it was really fantastic to bring out a book. That was amazing. And for the second year, which, as you say, I just accepted a 1 year term, it seemed to me the logical outreach is to circulate the book, to help reach it, to help the book reach different readers and different communities. So we're looking at 4 different cities where I would do a poetry translation evening, but with someone. For instance, I had the pleasure of doing a evening with state New York poet laureate Kamiko Han, where
Mhm.
we read poems inspired by translations, poems about the Zuihitsu, and I did translation workshops there with undergraduate and graduate students. My hope is for the cities that I take the book to, donors come forward, and 4 Queens College graduates will be selected, and they will accompany me to different cities, and they will do poetry translation workshops because I hope this is something that can continue without me. I feel like I want to get something started, and I also love the idea of giving younger poets and translators the opportunity to get started. So I will do an evening event celebrating poetry and translation, and they will do a community poetry translation workshop in a non-university setting. So there'll be like bookstores, community centers, maybe art galleries.
One of our audience members, commented on the idea of collaboration in translation, and I think that's one of the really beautiful things about this whole project is that it is an invitation to collaborate, to share voices, to share languages, to share stories, to get beyond the self, get beyond, even I think the act of translation is can be an egoless act. I think of the writer Walter Benjamin, who talks about writing as being a deeply engaged form of reading. And when I look at translation, that's even more so. It seems, whether or not you're revising and revising the translation, or just spending a lot of time, diving in to the original work itself.
Yeah, I want to say that for the second year, my project is called Words Bridging Worlds.
Mm,
So there may be different languages and different cultures, but it seems to me great poetry ignites and reignites our shared humanity,
mhm.
and um, and we need that now more than ever.
Right, right. And I just love the idea of that, you are going out and, inviting, a greater global communication. And like you said, yeah, we need it. When you first went to the Library of Congress, I know that you kind of marveled at walking around that around the library, and I'll say that if there's anybody in the DC area watching tonight, Arthur's going to be at the Library of Congress again with the British Poet Laureate Simon Armitage coming in a few weeks. So keep an eye out for that. But maybe you could, to close us out here, you can read us a poem that you wrote after first visiting the Library of Congress. I know at your inauguration, the staff there, the who have been so embattled, some of them were in tears, just to be valued through your poem. And maybe you could take us out by reading that.
Yeah, when I got the tour of the Library of Congress, I had no idea that I would go home and write a poem that would incorporate that, but I was so moved by the directors showing me different books in their collection. And this is the only poem that I've written in English that has a phrase in Spanish and a phrase in Chinese. It was fun. Here it is, Library of Congress. You peer down a lit corridor on the fifth tier of stacks where a million books breathe on shelves. Here's a book on neutrinos captured in Antarctica. Here's another on solar flares. A curator displays a book in vase script and points to a triangle with two dots. You wonder if you are looking at a pregnant woman, an enslaved man, or a human ear. You pull a book off a shelf and opening it here, del aire al aire como, then snap it shut. The air hums with honeybees. A second curator points at glittering gold script. Though you can't divine a word, you guess Farsi and dive into the marlin blue depth of the page. A third curator shows you Xinyuan, woodblock printed on mulberry paper, and as you read, a distant mind leaves the earth around it. You smell daylilies in a courtyard, and know you may caravan to Timbuktu, but there's no pear blossom end to what's within reach.
Mm. Thank you. Thank you so much. I just, hearing you read that, I go back to the first time, the first book we worked on together, Archipelago, and just I feel like you time and again reveal the world, open the world to me and to your readers. It's beautiful work, and it's such an honor for all of us at Copper Canyon to be a part of it. And I hope people will pick up a copy of Transient Worlds and of all your work. I know you're very beloved at Copper Canyon, and I know from readers around the world that you are. And I just want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. Arthur and I could go on talking like this. At least I could. You
No,
might
we
get
could.
tired, but
We could talk for
you know,
hours.
I love learning from you, as I'm sure we all do this evening. And just thank you for the work that you're doing on behalf of all of us. Um, and in the audience, if anybody wants to reach out to any of us at Copper Canyon, we love hearing from our readers and would love to have feedback on this and any of the other programming that we do online. So thank you, and good night. And thank you, Arthur.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here this evening.